Australia has produced her share of wonderful artists over the last century or so, of whom a number have gained international reputations. But what I want to share with you is a small selection of the many I'm fond of, regardless of reputation or international profile. All these artists have passed on, and you may wonder why I'm focusing on historical figures rather than young artists. And the answer is simple. The world has changed so much, even in my lifetime. The energies of those times are lost. Before the mass migrations over the last 30 years, well before the internet, and before the turbo-driven train of materialism steamrolled the cultures of most Western countries almost beyond recognition, they had an authentic voice. These works were not groundbreaking or impressive. They were the recordings of creative people who were skilled at their craft and had something to say of significance at the time. They speak to something in me that sees into their souls, some as children of the Australian bush, others who felt a more cosmic order around their lives. These paintings feel like old friends. 4 of these 5 artists had travelled overseas, and they were well aware of what was happening in America and the European art world at the time, and they were influenced by that, but they were also deeply influenced by their colonial culture, and it showed. We don't always view works of art for pleasure. There are many incredible artists whose work I find disturbing, moving, and deeply engaging in some way. But these few works I'm sharing with you now, I revisit from time to time just for the sheer aesthetic pleasure to relax and enjoy whatever it is that leaves me feeling good about the world. And there's a little bit of sentiment in the mix. My first artist wasn't groundbreaking, fabulous, or famous, but he was a significant figure in the Australian art scene, contemplative, observational. His name was Lin Onus. Onus was a self-taught artist of mixed Indigenous European ancestry. His father's father was a Yorta Yorta man from northern Victoria. His father's mother was of Scottish origin. His paintings were a fascinating bridge between Indigenous and Western art traditions, which was groundbreaking at the time. He had a remarkable ability to paint water, reflections and rocks with striking realism, but he combined that with the traditional line work technique called raak, or cross-hatching. Raak had a deep spiritual significance for Indigenous Jinung peoples from Maningrida and central Arnhem Land. So, in a sense, he was bringing together the physical and spiritual aspects of the Australian landscape in quite a profound way. And while they have a strong element of decoration, they're very captivating and moving when you stand in front of them in real time. His painting of 3 frogs I find fascinating. The design is traditional in the Western formal sense, but a detail shows his ability to create shadows beneath the surface of the water while maintaining the surface itself. So there are, in effect, 4 layers: the frog's heads above the water, the surface itself, the shadows on the surface, and the leaves and debris on the riverbed. And strangely, even though the whole image is stylized, one still has the sense that if one were to touch that mirrored surface, it would give way and you would sink down. It's very tactile, and even the frogs feel tactile. You feel as if you touched them, they'd be cold and slimy. His fish painting is equally intriguing. Again, there are 4 layers: the surface, the lake bed, the fish themselves, and their shadows on the lake bed. And the way he has somehow sculptured the cross-hatching to turn the forms creates a sense that those patterns are natural, that such a fish could possibly exist in real life. It's extraordinary, contrasting deliciously with the unfocused, more tonal textures of the riverbed below. How fascinating that there's nothing reflecting on the surface of the water to place where it begins and how deep the water is. But the shadows of the fish are what indicate that they're suspended, and what we know of fish and water fills in the non-visible element to give it credibility. This is my favourite work of his, I think, not just because of the colours, the light and texture, but because the eyes of the fish with the spot of reflected light bring them to life. You can almost feel the souls or spirits of each of them trying to communicate with you. And in Crocodile, the creature is underwater. The surface now is defined by the floating leaves rather than shadows, and the beautiful undulating curve of the animal's body and the ridges down his armour with two little co-inhabitants for company. They look to be two lizards or something. Maybe they're offspring. So you can just see it a little better in this photo. I've had to enhance the image a little so it can be seen better on the screen because it's quite a dark painting, but it's just exquisitely executed. And that cross-hatching on the back, it's not just the pattern itself, but look at how it creates the feeling of the animal, the ridges of the armour of the animal's back. Quite extraordinary. When you visit the Tweed Regional Gallery in northern New South Wales, you go upstairs and along a corridor where appears to be a small cottage, a small museum of deliciousness that is a reconstruction of the interior of the home of the late, much-loved artist Margaret Olley, including much of its contents and a permanent exhibition of her paintings. Delicious, that to me describes the majority of Margaret Olley's paintings. Her home was not only one of her painting subjects, it was a painting in itself, full of bright colours, flowers, heritage furniture, antiques and relics, a treasure house of fun and aesthetic stimulation. Everything she created was a celebration of colour, shape and life, a record of the visual world around her. No pretensions, no academic or philosophical projections, just sheer joy. She had no children. I think her paintings were her children, hundreds, if not thousands of them. You feel her joy in the simple act of applying coloured pigments to a surface, in the same way a musician will spend hours playing their instrument for the sheer joy of listening to and creating harmonic sound, harmonic colour. And yellow is the actual colour of the wall in this painting entitled Morning Light. All the walls in her home were painted in fairly strong colours. Nothing was white or a pale tone. Unlike most of her paintings, there's a sense of classical form in this image. The angle of the settee leading from lower right-hand corner into the midpoint, a third the height of the canvas, with a single chair on the left facing inwards to counterbalance it. I talk about sweet spots in regard to form, and here the green mantelpiece sits in the upper left sweet spot, giving a point of focus, but really the subject isn't the point. It was an excuse to sit and place paint on canvas, and in viewing it one feels the pleasure she felt playing with colour, with patterns, with texture. In Lemons and Oranges, as in all her still life paintings, the reference to Matisse is obvious. His paintings had a high profile at the time and there were many imitators of his style, but Olley wasn't trying to make any profound statements about life and art. I doubt she wasted energy analysing her work. The interesting thing about this one is the emphasis on green and yellow orange, which leaves out the red tones, which is placed in the background instead to lift the colour balance. My technical brain wants to break down the overall form of the painting and analyse other aspects of it, but if I just look at it in a disinterested way, then it gives me a lot of pleasure. Then we have Cornflowers, a lovely interplay between various shades of blue around the colour of the flowers themselves, with a splash of red ochre in the table and the scene outside the window as the complementary, which helps intensify the blue. And the lovely mix of textures and colours in Ranunculus, the glistening hard porcelain surfaces, the softness of the various fruits, and the warm rough surface of the timber cupboard. In citrus fruits, we come back to the intense yellows and oranges, with a splash of blue in the plate that makes the orange sing. I think of Kandinsky with his passion for reds and yellows in his early works, but also back to Cézanne and the edge of the table in the foreground. I also think of the American watercolorist Jean Dobell, who wrote a book called Making Colour Sing, in which she emphasized the importance of complementaries if you want more light and intensity in your painting. And white cloth, the colours subdued, and the focus not on the fruits and other objects, but on the folds in the cloth, the play of light and shadow, which takes one back to art school exercises, but how delightfully she played with it. So that was Margaret, a national treasure, much loved and celebrated, a generous benefactor and mentor to many. If I lived near that gallery, I'd visit often just for a regular splash in this pool of visual joy. Sir William Dobell was a caricaturist in paint, and a good one, although it got him into some strife. In 1943, he won the Archibald Prize for Portraiture with an image of fellow artist Joshua Smith, who sued him unsuccessfully, but it aroused lots of conversations about how portraiture should be defined. Wistful humour was his modus operandi, but he was a skilled craftsman, and that's what made his work so powerful. Not only did the court rule in his favour, but he went on to win it a second time with this portrait of Margaret Olley, who you've just met. I love the way she appears to bloom on the canvas, just like her flowers do. Look at the way he seems to tease the image out of the canvas rather than place it on the canvas. The lovely wisps of her shawl, so soft and ephemeral, a puff of wind might blow it away. You can feel the soft sensuousness of the fabric and the voluptuousness of the figure filling it out from beneath. In detail, the back of the chair, the inside of her hat, and the background wall blend into one another, but the decorative timber carving has just enough definition to give it a sense of solidity. And the furniture behind her seems almost alive. It swirls around behind her, rhythmic and organic. The mirror barely defined, reflecting her hat and black hair and creating extra depth to the space. The whole painting is full of movement, the animate still and focused, the inanimate alive. His portrait of Helena Rubinstein, the founder of the cosmetics company of the same name, is an image I saw on many occasions in my youth, and it impressed me enormously at the time. It is so obviously a caricature, but he captures the strength and focus of a serious businesswoman, certain of her standing in the world, not to be messed with. And then there's the portrait of artist and compatriot Joshua Smith, obviously also a caricature, which won the Archibald Prize for Portraiture in 1943. The decision was highly controversial at the time, since it was a caricature, and the rules of entry until then hadn't included such a scenario. But the subsequent court case decided in the artist's favour, so it was a landmark of the history of the prize and the art world in Australia. So my next choice of artist might surprise you in light of those you've just looked at. Knowing the prevailing sensibilities at the time, I think he was a bit of an anomaly in the art world. Energy, sensuality, that's how I would summarise Brett Whiteley's work. Every curve was an explosion of sensual energy, every brushstroke a sweep of colour on the canvas. His earliest large-scale work was created in New York in 1969, where he lived for 2 years on a Harkness Fellow Scholarship. Its title was The American Dream, and it was flatly rejected by his gallery, after which he left the US. Too political, apparently. It reflected his concerns, and probably most people's at the time, about the Vietnam War, but also his personal struggle with addiction. Until then, he had enjoyed spectacular success in London and New York. This painting seems to contain the full gamut of the American psyche, with the purity of the sun, the hummingbird, the egret, images of the ideal life, and then the images become increasingly chaotic, culminating in the darker paintings to the top right, which include a nuclear reaction that looks organic, almost like an orgasmic culmination of the underlying energies, which threatens its citizens and the world to this day. A few years later, back in Sydney, he created Alchemy, all 16 metres of it, which looks spectacular in real life, as you might imagine. This transformational painting has the same sense of movement as American Dream, from calm to chaos, and it's much more sensual. Interestingly, not in a confrontational way, but a somehow engaging way, stylized enough to not cause offence, but the intention is very clear. These works somehow wake us up to something within us that most of us can't express within the confines of civilized society, but drive us silently from within, from our shared organic roots and our humanity. Even the darker images have a sense of joy and growth and celebration. I was fortunate enough to see these works and others in a retrospective of his work at the National Gallery of Victoria some years ago, and it was a few hours of sheer joy. However, despite this spectacular foray into the world of expressionism, Whiteley realised that he was more interested in recording the physical world around him, and his later works were more figurative, including many nudes, which I don't want to show here for obvious reasons. Whiteley was influenced early in his career by his mentor, Lloyd Rees, another much-loved Australian artist whose painting Road to Berry he copied, as you see here, exaggerating the curves of the road and hills, almost as if trying to get into the mind of the older artist. He even made a comment to the effect that Rees' paintings were very sensual. And you see that playing out in images such as Marilyn Bird of 1980, and then we have Yellow of 1975, and then a unique view of Sydney Opera House in 1982. The sails look like a great seabird about to take flight. In 1977, Whiteley won the coveted Archibald Prize with an extraordinary image of himself entitled Art, Life and the Other Thing. It's a kind of triptych. At the top right is a tiny photographic portrait, and then in the centre the elongated torso, typical of all his figures, beneath a head in which he no longer seems to recognise himself, except for the single eye, his strength, the clarity of his artistic vision, the observer, perhaps. He seems to be painting three aspects of himself: the face the world sees, his inner psyche, and the subconscious. The figure holds a sketch of that former controversial prize-winning painting by William Dobell I showed you earlier, as if he expected this entry to also be controversial because it too is a caricature. The roaring lion to the left is that powerful other thing, which was a serious drug addiction going back all the way back to his time in New York, and which was sadly eventually to take his life. And I could end on that sad note, but what I find interesting is that there is nothing self-pitying about this image. He remains the observer. The photo is an attractive one of him. Certainly no effects of drugs in that image. The confused face in the centre panel doesn't seem to be disturbed emotionally. It's just a sense of there being maybe too many options or not knowing what direction to take. But there's no sense of any dark forces behind it. It's just an honest but detached observation about who he was. And we've been blessed with some amazing artworks as his legacy. Grace Cossington Smith spent her whole life in the country of her birth, apart from a trip overseas for 2 years to the UK and Germany. She was heavily influenced by the post-impressionists whose work she would have witnessed during that time, and it's interesting to see how her use of divided brushstrokes developed over the years by comparing this self-portrait done within 2 years of her return from that trip with another one created 30 years down the track when she was in her 50s. She tackled a wide range of subjects from interiors to portraiture and landscapes, and her painting The Sock Knitter of her sister Madge knitting socks for soldiers, which was done in the same year as the self-portrait, the first one, is regarded as the first post-impressionist painting to be exhibited in Australia. So she was regarded as one of the country's most important 20th century artists. Smith's most iconic work is probably Bridge in Curve of 1930, a study of the construction of Sydney Harbour Bridge, the longest steel arch bridge in the world at the time. Her dedication to the post-impressionist ideal with its flat divided brushstrokes is evident in this image. What's striking is her use of bright colours, bright blue shadows and warm salmon-tinted areas where the sun hits the dark heavy metal. It seems to float in mid-air. The preparatory sketch she did was highly detailed in terms of colour relationships. She used warm reds and yellows frequently in her work, and here they lift the whole painting as a splash of colour in the foreground buildings. She painted many interiors, as did so many women artists who would have felt rather self-conscious working under the public gaze at the time. The textures of the divided brushstrokes creating a cohesive whole, perspective and form being almost irrelevant, tonal realism totally absent. As with Margaret Olley's work, it was mostly about colour, but in this case with a commitment to the style she had chosen to work with. And as with Olley's work, when you see a set of these interiors together in a single space, they sing to you. It's a symphony of light and colour. She was certainly of her time, as was Margaret Olley, but she did it well. And while I love both these paintings, it's her scenes of North Shore Sydney that grab me the most. This painting of trees has a strong feeling of cubism, but without the heavy browns and greys of Picasso and George Braque's work, with whom she would no doubt have been familiar. The shapes and colours interweave in a delicious tapestry of subtle tones, the overall design being somewhat informal, the use of mauves against ochres and muted reds against the greens, adding a subtle touch of vibration and movement. And while I generally prefer images that are well balanced and more formal in conception, I have no problems with her less formal design. And last but not least, Eastern Road, Turramurra. This is the area in which she lived all her life, north of Sydney. It's very hilly. That area leads up to, eventually, the foothills of the Blue Mountains. It feels as though you're on a scenic railway. There's such a strong sense of gravity pulling you down into the gully with enough acceleration to sweep up and over the next rise. Almost the whole painting is a tapestry of shades of green, my favourite colour. It feels settled, homely, but full of movement, and one can almost sense the amount of horsepower needed to haul the buggy up towards you. I think tapestry is a good word, something constructed rather than felt spontaneously, but thoughtful and considered, artistic. There are many wonderful artists I could have shared with you in this video, but these 5 I've mentioned hold a place in my heart for some reason, and I hope you enjoyed meeting them. Until next time, stay well, stay blessed.